The starting point is that when I was doing organizing, there was always we were always focused on strategy because we were always David trying to deal with Goliath. And so when you don't have the resources Goliath has, you have to be more resourceful. You have to be smarter, you have to be more creative, you have to be more committed. So strategy was very, very important. But you can have a great strategy and nobody shows up, and guess what? You don't have such a great strategy if people are afraid and divided. So there was always this second dimension of motivation that was equally, if not more important. And so whenever we would do a campaign, we would have a story, we would have a strategy, and we would have a structure, sort of the three elements there in order to get that together. Well, when I came back to school, I discovered that psychologists had studied this. Jerome Bruner, in particular at the Ed School here, had studied the different ways in which we map the world. And we map the world cognitively in terms of where things are in it, which is very helpful for finding our way from here to there. It's how to answer the question, how do I get from here to there? It's the efficiency side. But if we want to understand why I care, or why anybody cares, you can't get there from that. So there's a second mapping that we make of the world, which is affective or emotional. We attach emotional value. We attach that which inspires, that which frightens, that which causes despair or disgust, that which lifts us up. And it's that second mapping, that emotional mapping of the world, which is where the domain of values is grounded. Because values are not intellectual ideas, they are what actually moves us to act. St. Augustine said it's one thing to know the good, that's fine, but loving it is what enables action upon it. So knowledge does not equal action. And so the emotional dimension is really where the whole work of values is. And if we're going to talk about values, then we have to come up with a way to communicate about emotional content. You know, we have over here the whole side of logical arguments and so forth. It's very good on cognition. Doesn't do so much on why we care, why others care. And so it turns out that one of the ways in which one of the languages, you know, Pascal said the heart has reason of which reason does not know. One of the languages through which we communicate information about values is narrative. And that's what we're going to be exploring a little more specifically. But the significance of emotion for leadership right here is, well, most of the time we're on autopilot. We operate out of habit most of the time, right? And, you know, so I'm driving, and it's very efficient because otherwise I'd have to learn how to, relearn my car every time I get in it. So I'm driving along, I'm on autopilot, everything's fine. Truck pulls out, I stay on autopilot, not so good. So our brains have developed what's called a surveillance system to detect anomaly, surprise, the unexpected. So my brain detects the truck and it's going truck, 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 and I experience that anxiety, and it's a good thing, that anxiety, because it calls my attention to the fact that habit will not do. So that's helpful. Sometimes the leadership challenge we face is to, this is going to sound weird, is to create anxiety. In other words, to find a way to counter the inertia and apathy that goes with habit with counter emotional capacity. Urgency is one. You know, the deadline. It's got to happen now. I have a decision to make about my whole future, but tomorrow I have a problem set. What do I work on tonight? Problem set. Urgency will always displace the important. One of the challenges is to connect the urgent and important, and that's a big challenge the climate change movement has faced for some time, is how to make something so important urgent enough that we experience its urgency. Another is anger, and by anger I don't mean rage, but I do mean outrage. I mean the sort of thing we're experiencing daily every time you turn on the news and you hear what the latest Trumpification or whatever you want to call it is, frankly. I mean, there's a kind of moral violence in a way, and it produces outrage, and it ought to, because it's a contradiction between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. And that tension can be powerfully creative of action. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about anger. That tension that becomes a resource for courage and for action. But let's say you do a great job of making everybody anxious. You got everybody anxious, great. What's the default from anxiety? You're feeling very anxious, so then what does that easily turn into? You betcha. You betcha. You know the old fight, flight, or freeze and hope it doesn't notice you, whatever it is, and goes by, right? Now, that was very functional. That fear reaction, when we were dealing with saber-toothed tigers, that was very, very functional. You know, fight, probably not. Flight, most likely. Freeze, maybe. Now, but once we started to live in communities with other people, to react to every unexpected event, every surprise, every potentially threatening event with fear becomes profoundly counterproductive. So we began to learn ways to access the emotional capacity to respond as opposed to react. In other words, how to counter the fear with access to hopefulness, to counter the isolation that goes with fear through access to empathy, with the sense of self-doubt that goes with fear, with access to a sense of self-worth, or what we call ICMAD, you can make a difference. So the challenge becomes in leadership sometimes how to create the urgency, but on the other hand, how to counter the fear with hope. And by hope, I don't mean flowers in May. I'm not talking about optimism. I'm not talking about, hey, everything's good. Maimonides, the 12th century scholar, had a very good definition of hope. It's a little complicated. He says, hope is belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. Now, what he's saying is that to be a realist is to recognize that while it is always probable Goliath will win, sometimes David does. While it was utterly improbable we would elect a black man president of this country in 2007, it actually happened. And we know in our own life experiences of those moments of possibility. And that sense of possibility, for me, is where hopefulness is. And cultivating that sense of possibility that we're not prisoners of probability. And of course, then empathy, or call it love, to counter the isolation and the sense of self-worth.